How's everybody? All right. So I did wonder, am I in the light enough? I did wonder how you guys, it's 9/11, so it's 18 years since 9/11. 9/11, 18 years ago, I was rising to go to a pastor's prayer meeting. And, the thing I'll never forget was the shock of the whole thing was bad enough, but the shock when those buildings imploded down. So let me just ask a question, because this is, since it has been 18 years, is there anybody here you do not remember where you were on 9/11? You do not remember? Okay. One, he was young. Two, oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah, okay, well, you were in India, right? And a third, okay. So everybody in their lifetime will have those things that are momentous enough that what happens to you is you never forget where you were. I never forget where I was when John Kennedy was shot. And then I remember the double shock of coming home on a Sunday morning of all things from church. I was living with my grandparents in 1963. Was it 60? Yeah. And actually, I wasn't living with them then, so I revised it. But I remember coming to their house and having them tell us that Lee Harvey Oswald had been shot on TV. So on live TV. And so a lot of people, that's the event they remember. But what I want to talk to you about tonight is kingdom leadership and how to lead in a crisis. And to begin with, it would be wrong not to say that one of the things that's on my mind is this 9/11 thing, because this is what inspired me to do this. And I think that by now it's fair to ask some questions, but let's just put this up here first. These are the flights that hit the World Trade Center, and this is the one that hit the Pentagon, and then the one that was headed for the White House but crashed into the field in Pennsylvania. So 2,977 victims, that does not include the hijackers, die, and another 6,000 plus injured, and then residual more from people who've been with ongoing sickness in the aftermath. And the 19 hijackers die, including 15 Saudi Arabians. And there's a couple things that you'll never forget. Most of us would remember that moment when President Bush stood out there on the rubble and somebody said, "We can't hear you." And he said, well, I can hear you. And pretty soon the whole world is going to hear us. Something to that effect. And it was a moment that what he did was, he did something that's absolutely essential for leadership. He made a connection with the people that set the tone for his entire 4-year term. The question that has to be asked, and I'm like, because it's way too hot a political potato, because I have a lot of questions about what we did in response. And what you know is that if you're a leader and you connect with the people and you have a national catastrophe, you can parlay that into enough favor to take actions that you would not be able to take in other situations. So the momentum carries you. Interestingly, in August of 2005, Katrina hit. And Katrina actually ultimately directly impacted us. And we still have one person in our church that came as a refugee from New Orleans. Linda came here, and President Bush flew over in a plane. And in that instance, we got video of him peering out a little hole in a window, and he utterly failed to connect. And then it got turned into all kinds of other political charges. And just as the connection in the one crisis was enabling, the disconnection in the next crisis was disabling. Now, that wasn't the only factor by the time you're into your second term, and with America being as badly polarized as we are. So I'm telling you up front, if you're going to be a leader in a time of crisis, and I'm going to say even a kingdom leader, and the one we're going to look at tonight is certainly a kingdom leader, you have to make a personal connection with the people you're leading. And if you don't have it, you won't be able to lead. It still is true that leadership is not positional, but relational. Ultimately and utterly. From a position, you can do much, but from a relationship, you can do much, much more. And I'll start with that. What did happen out of that, and I think it bears saying, is the war on terror began, and we're 18 years into the war on terror. And wow, you talk about something that's changed the map, changed the culture, changed us in a lot of ways. And we still don't have enough distance to have the perspective to say, okay, what did all this lead to? And let me just say this. When you're talking about national leadership in the sense of such things, it doesn't reach the level of what we're talking about with kingdom leadership. So I'm going to talk about leadership in general, but specifically kingdom leadership, which has a whole different dynamic. Although for a Christian, there's no difference in secular and sacred. Everything you do in life is one thing. And the secular sacred divide is something that's a creation of the last 100 years of human history, because it's not the way people have thought historically. You did not categorize your life in boxes that allowed you to separate from yourself. You were a self, and the Hebrew way of thinking is you are you. All right, let's dig into this. Crisis is inevitable. Bottom line, you're going to have crisis. So I've been a pastor now since 1977, and almost every church I've been in at one time or another, we had major crisis. Certainly in New Life City, we had major crisis that we have to deal with. And it was like our own issue, our own crisis. But wherever people are, there's crisis. Wherever there's crisis, there's conflict. And the more complex our lives get, the more conflict and the more crisis you have. And what crisis does is it tears down the illusion that we're in control. We are not in control. And what we have to do is control what we can. And the goal of crisis, if you're going to go at this, is you got to understand the inevitability of it, and then you got to go, okay, what's my role in this? And always the role in kingdom leadership is transformation of crisis into something good. Because you can't stop the bad. And in fact, I'll come to that. But I had some fun with this. I found this and said, I got to give this. I should have folded it in on you, but religious views on trouble. I'll read it anyway, just for effect. If you're a Taoist, trouble happens. If you're in Confucianism, Confucius says trouble happens. Buddhism says trouble happens, but it's not really trouble. Zen Buddhism says, listen to the sound of trouble happening. Hinduism says this trouble has happened before. Islam says if trouble happens, Allah ordained it. Protestantism says if trouble happens, it's the devil's fault. Catholics are my favorite. If trouble happens, you deserve it. And then the Jewish, why is trouble happening to me? It's like I said, when I came across that, I'm like, that's fantastic. And so let me tell you what tonight is not. Tonight is not an explanation of trouble. The explanation of trouble is trouble happens. Crisis happens. Pain happens. And by the way, I need to preach on this with some detail. Christians get asked all the time, if God is good, why do bad things happen? And if God has all power, why do bad things happen? So they say, either God's not good or God's not all powerful. Listen to me now when I tell you this, and please get this. Christianity is not an answer to a philosophical problem. Christianity tells us where it came from and how it will be resolved. The Christian gospel is our answer to the problem of evil. It's not a you get this? So stop trying to enter into somebody else's world to answer problems, answer questions that you're not really designed to answer. Because you come to this problem and you'll get hung on the heels of a dilemma. When I was in seminary, I actually took a whole class on the problem of evil. By the way, I'm fascinated about the whole 9/11 thing, because one of the professors that wrote about the problem of evil was a guy named David Ray Griffin from Claremont in California. And he was what's called a process theologian. And so he wrote about this from the evolutionary perspective. Anybody ever heard of David Ray Griffin? Okay. Surely there's some conspiratorial people in my church. Because interesting thing happened. This absolutely blew my mind. David Ray Griffin retired from his career as a theologian in an academic institution to become a 9/11 truther, and wrote about 5 books on the 9/11 truthism. So some of you may actually have his books and you don't know it. Go back and look. Anyway, that's just me being a little naughty. No, the gospel is the resolution of the problem of evil, not the explanation. Jesus Christ is the resolution of the problem, not the explanation of the problem. Our Christian faith does not give you answers in that sweet package that you think you can make it fit. It says, here's what is, and here's what God has done about it. And it's not that that we don't have an answer, it's that people don't like the answer. Because what we have to offer the world is Jesus Christ and Him alone. All right. So, number 2, plan for problems. Anybody see the movie about the pilot Sully? That movie? Did you see that? Okay, that's planning for problems. And you say, well, what does that mean? That means that man spent his entire life devoted to what he was doing and knowing and understanding what he was doing. And so when the crisis hit, here was a man who went into a mode of being that is only available to people who devote themselves to what they're up to. And listen, this is what you and I are, what God has designed us for, is that we are so practiced at being and doing a certain thing that when the pressure comes, virtue flows out of us. And I'm telling you, so this pilot, John Maxwell tells a story about himself being on a plane, and the plane was landing, and it came very, very close to ground and hit wind shear and then dropped dramatically. And so that it was not going to land good The plane did hit and then began to careen. And then that pilot, he said, just pulled that plane straight up in the air and got it back up in the air, came back around and landed it again. And of course, Maxwell says when he got off that plane, he kissed the ground, and then he found the pilot and kissed the pilot. And then he said to the pilot, "What was that?" And the pilot said, all my training taught me this: I would have more stability in the air than on the ground. And so I took the problem into the air than on the ground. So it's the same kind of thing I'm talking to you about the pilot that landed the plane in the river. It's the act of spending your whole life perfecting what you're up to. You'll go into a place where you don't know why you know what you know. You don't know how you knew what to do. You were automatically doing what you were trained to do. This is what we want our military people to be. We want them to be trained so that in crisis they go into training instead of explaining. Right? So there's where we go. So now, so you plan for problems. So there's some things that I've done intentionally in church life that both worked and didn't work. So I planned for fiscal crisis. In 2008, when fiscal crisis came, we were ready. And then later, when a new variable came into fiscal crisis for us, we weren't ready. And we had to go into get well mode, manage a bigger crisis. So preparation, the plans is preparation for what you can anticipate. And the reality is that things are going to happen that you can't anticipate. And I've already said it, virtue is the outworking of discipline. For every believer, discipline is our discipleship. And this is where you want to be when the pressure is on you, and it's coming. So I'm literally not talking about something that's never going to happen to you. It's going to happen to you, and it's not going to happen to you just once. It's going to keep happening in this life. So part of the preparation or the plan for a problem is to accept what happens. Most of us go into denial mode when stuff is happening. So that I was listening to a leader talk about the preparation for crisis, and this lady was describing. She said there's routine crisis. And I thought, well, that's cool. And she said routine crisis was things like an earthquake or a tornado or a hurricane. I was pretty impressed with that, right? That's routine crisis, because that's not what I think of as a routine crisis. But if you're in the field that crisis preparation is your job, those are routine crisis. And then what she said is, but what you have to get ready for is what's called novelty crisis. And that's when a routine crisis has variables that nobody could anticipate, like Katrina. And then she said the thing that was strange with Katrina was that some of the people that were in charge of the emergency preparedness and making decisions were literally watching as the levees broke. And so she said these people were prepared for levees to break, but they weren't, and they were prepared for hurricanes, but they weren't prepared for them together. And she said they were literally, the people who were making decisions were literally standing there looking at a screen, frozen, and saying, what's going on? And it was right in front of them. And of course, that thing became, much worse than anybody could have imagined. So if you're in crisis, you got to go. You got to say this is really happening, and you got to engage it quick. And so those are just three things that happen if you refuse it, or if you live with it, or if you say, I got to accept it and seek to change it. That's the purpose again. Crisis leadership is about changing outcomes. Crisis leadership is about the end being better than you could hope for. All right? And so if you're a leader, you don't go into defending yourself mode. You go into dealing with the problem mode. You accept it. Some of that stuff I'm not going to just read to you. Don't need to, because I've got more coming up. All right, number 3, assess the problem. This is so huge. Everything I have studied in every direction, spiritual, practical, everything, they all said, if you got to know what's going on. You got to be a person that does your discovery. You got to do discovery to say, what is happening here? Now, I remember when that happened to us. And I don't talk about this much, but I'm going to talk about it tonight because it's really seminal. 6 years ago, we had a financial crisis, and we went from being flush with cash to being broke. And it happened on my watch. And the first question is, what has happened? Right? And let me tell you what, I'm saying this because it's not as easy to discover as you think. And what we found that we actually had to begin to act in the process of solving the problem while we were finding out what the problem was. Because there were bills to pay. There were creditors to justify. There were a lot of problems to solve. And so if you're going to assess the problem, again, one of my favorites is John Maxwell, and he says your mind is like a parachute. It works best when it's open. And what you got to do is you got to figure out what the big picture is. What is really going on here? And so he says that the problem is that when you're dealing with trying to get to the big picture is that the biggest problem somebody will have is lack of experience. Because if you're young and you're faced with a problem you've never been faced with before, or if you're just faced with a crisis that you've never been faced with before, you don't have anything to build on. And he says that's going to really prevent you from being able to assess the problem. And so you either need one to have some successes, or to have some people around you who have some successes. And this is what happens in ministry. Now that I've been in it all this time, is I watch young guys go into ministry, especially local church ministry, and something will happen, and they're like, "The sky is falling." Like, get used to it. It's going to fall a lot. And what happens is if you have experience dealing with it, then you see patterns, and you kind of know how this thing's going to go. And so you know not to overreact, and you know what steps are there to take and what steps aren't there to take. And if you're dealing with church crisis and you're dealing with people, there's some really bad ideas on how to treat people, and there's some better ideas on how to treat people. There are some good ones, but good luck if you find that, especially the first time out. Lack of confidence. Because when there's a crisis, people want somebody who has confidence. They want to follow somebody who acts confidently. And if you have lack of experience, you probably have lack of confidence, and you probably have lack of perspective. Lack of perspective is the one I want to touch on the most, and the one we'll go into in the scripture, which means this: if you have a lack of perspective, you're dominated by your emotions. And so I'm going to have a fair amount to say about that, so I won't get bogged down here. Since we got a lot, let me keep going. So how do you see the big picture? How do you really get hold of the big picture? Surround yourself with problem solvers. And by the way, you won't actually know who the problem solvers are all the time. You'll know some people who have solved some problems, but when you get in a crisis, what you're going to find is that some people who have been there before will come along around you. I had what I considered, and again, I was a young pastor, and I had a really big crisis. Which, I mean, if you were a young pastor and you were actually in one of your very first churches, and you were there in the church field for 2 weeks, and a couple in your church, the husband was the chairman of the deacons, and the wife was the one who ran the children's ministry. And if they got mad at you and left on your third Sunday in the church, and the church is small, you would be like I was when that happened to me, which was sitting in my office on Monday morning going, I wonder if I can go back where I came from. And never forget, a man walked in my office, and he was, somebody who'd been around the church a while, and it was somebody who had a perspective. And he walks in my office and says, "Hey, I thought you could use a friend on a Monday morning." And I'm trying to be cool. Like, what are you talking about? And he just said, "Well, I just came by to tell you it's not as bad as you think." And what I found out was that he knew a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know. And rather than everybody being horrified that I had done this terrible thing to the church fellowship, they were like, "Yes, we love them, but they were tormenting us." And so crisis averted because I had somebody who understood the problem. Bigger problems than what you want is you want to have people that are experienced. I remember going into a larger church I was on staff at a church, and I remember, man, the problems that church had scared me. This was actually before the church I'm telling you about. I was even younger. And I just remembered that I kept seeing these people who were unperturbed by things that I thought were catastrophes. But they had wisdom, they had perspective, they knew how to solve problems, and they also knew that good people could have conflict without hating each other. Which, if you want to know the truth, that's something that if you're a pastor of a church, takes some time to discover. And those are the kind of crises that you deal with. So surround yourself with problem solvers, ask a lot of questions. Ask a lot of questions. Like, what is the problem here? Because you might not know what the problem is. Get the background of what's going on. What's the worst this can be? What's the best this can be? What's the best and worst options of what we can do? Don't forget to ask, and I'll talk about this at the end, what did you learn? And is there a plan for after you get through this? And then who did get trained? Who came along beside you and learned something? So it's really been kind of fun, like church-wise, because you go, after many years, you go, yeah, I don't get that. I actually find that I get much calmer these days when crisis comes. With the exception of 6 years ago, I didn't get very calm, to be honest with you. Okay. And then remember, others have survived. And when we went through our crisis, what helped me so much was to be around business people who came in and said, "Well, Alan, this has happened to us and our businesses. You think you're the first one that got blindfolded? Do you think you're the first one that was blind to what was going on right in front of you? It happened to us." And that was like, wow. Because I'm talking about people that I'd respected a lot more than I respected myself. And they would say, "No, this has happened to us. This is the sort of thing that happens if you live a long life." And once again, they saw the big picture. Once again, they saw the big picture, and they said, "What do we do?" And that's where I want to come to and start to get in the scripture. So the first question is, what has happened? And this is where we're going to start having some fun, because I love this text. How many of you have had Mama Gail's class, Strengthen Yourself in the Lord? Bunch of you. So you know that this is the text that's based on, right? This is the text that the whole book is based on. This is where we pick up in 1 Samuel 30. But if you read the chapters before 1 Samuel 30, I want you to remember something. This is before David became king. He was anointed, but he wasn't yet, Saul hadn't died, and he hasn't yet been fully coronated and entered into the fullness of it. And David is rejected by Saul and by Israel. And then he's with the Philistines, and it's an amazing thing. The Philistines reject him, which is to say, somebody has said, when the devil's folks reject you, you know you're in trouble. You can't even, the devil won't even take you on his team. So he's rejected, but he had been out as if to go to battle, and he comes back home. Now, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negev and against Ziklag. They overcame Ziklag, they burned it with fire, and they'd taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off. Obviously, that was written afterwards because they didn't know that at the time, and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. How many of you know if the thing is burning with fire, you see the smoke before you get there? This is what's that book about Alexander who had a very bad, rotten, no good day? Y'all all know that book? This is that day. And so the first thing to go is what has happened. And what we said a while ago, this is really important. Now, let me preface this. 6 years ago, Kim Moss came to our church for the first time. Thank you. And Kim was not only, by the way, Kim travels the world now in her prophetic ministry. And we were not only, we were her first time to go to a church beyond her church and minister in the prophetic. And in other words, we actually launched her into a translocal ministry. And now she's a dear friend of the house. But we have this thing that we say about Kim, which is that we loathe to see her coming. Because I'm telling you, she hasn't been here a single time that something didn't get the bodies got found buried in the sand. I mean, her prophetic ministry for us has been very revelational in ways that revealed things that were troubling. Well, what I won't forget was that on the Sunday morning that she was here, she preached from this passage. And she said, no, I'm not just preaching from this passage. I'm giving you guys this passage prophetically. And I literally leaned over to Gail and said, that's like our passage. That's like our text. Gail, that's what you teach all over the place. That's, And we were like, wonder what that's about. And if you read this passage, just read that right there and say, I'm giving you this prophetically. Which is, you lost everything. And it's pretty much your fault. So, I was glad she gave it to us, but not for the reasons of what the passage said. Because 3 days later, we discovered that we were in a major crisis. And I mean, it was bad. And I'm going to tell you what your pastor, this man of God, I went into my phone booth and came out worse than I went in. I literally went to my office. I made some initial discoveries, and then until I went, oh, wait, I don't want to know anymore. And then I went to my office to make some phone calls, which was to tell people to whom we had made promises and to whom we owed money that they weren't going to get paid. And I laid down on the floor of my office, and my office had a wall in the middle of the room, so you could go around the wall and lay down on the floor and hide. And I ugly cried. I'm talking about big ugly cried. Papa Jack was here, he would testify, because Papa Jack said, I answered my phone. And he said, Papa Jack? Woo! He said, he cried for 15 minutes without catching his breath. And then he says, and when he finally told me what was going on, he said, I was relieved. He said, I thought he was running a house of prostitution. I'm like, he was relieved. So David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. In other words, here came the emotions. And David's 2 wives have been taken captive. And verse 5, and David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because they were all bitter in their soul, each for his sons and daughters. And remember, basically what we're saying here is that the preparations that needed to be made for protecting the camp while they were out and potentially doing battle, no preparations had been made that were adequate to protect the home base. So in other words, this thing was David's fault. And probably saying more than I ought to say, but when you've come through let me tell you something. When something's been dealt with, here's how you know something's been dealt with. You're not ashamed anymore. Right? So I remember I had a meeting with the elders and the trustees at my house. And I walked in the room and I said, I've brought my resignation. Start this meeting off with, I've brought my resignation. And before they ever heard the problem, one of the men said, put that up and don't you ever get it out again. Now what's going on? That's called relationship. Now, I only say that because they didn't stone me, but I thought I should have been stoned. Right? And so what I'm glad about, I got to be honest with you, when I went back and read this passage, this was my favorite part of it. Because it said, he went and they wept until they had no more strength to weep. Because I was like, yep, that was how it went. You don't cry it out. You just can't cry anymore. There's nothing left to cry about. And so don't be surprised if in the crisis you're still the one that has to help lead the way through the crisis, and you're the one that's most broken. But this is important to get dealt with. You notice I put the little note at the bottom. Remember, it can get worse and probably will before it's solved. Literally this week had a conversation with some friends and said, okay, you need to know this is going to get worse before it gets better. Anytime I'm dealing with somebody in a counseling situation, I tell them, which I don't do much of anymore. Anyway, I don't do much of that anymore, but I used to tell people all the time, I said, look, here's the deal. When you go into the process of dealing with the problem, go see Sam. And know this about Sam. Sam's job is to be the surgeon. He's going to cut you open before he sews you up and heals you. You got to take out the cancer. So in the healing, so things get worse. Again, things get worse. But here you are in the emotions, and this is where it's really, really important. You cannot make decisions in this space. And you cannot solve problems in this space. So he's dealing with himself, and he's dealing with the problems. And look, he's facing what could happen to him, but he's not solving the problem. So how to deal with your emotions. And you first got to deal with the question of if you're being controlled by your emotions. I come from the evangelical world. How many of you come from evangelical, non-charismatic churches? Let me see some hands. These are the people who've been programmed to not be emotional. And what we're told in those churches is don't be ruled by your emotions. But what we hear them say is don't have any. And so the idea is that you just choke off your humanity. Well, what we say in this church is, no, we want you to have emotions. We're gonna stir some up if you don't have some. You have to have emotions. And in this church, we actually think they're a blessing. They're part of the totality of being human being. And as a human being, you grieve, you mourn, you laugh. That's why so people say this is emotionalism. And we're okay with them saying that. Because I'm gonna go back to this. David, is this just pure emotionalism? Then this is a man who's broken. And in the middle of it, he has to deal with himself. So we don't want to be ruled by emotions, but we do have to deal with them. So here's the deal. If you're striving to relieve your emotions, you're not solving the problem. What do you mean by that? Well, big emotions are depression, which will make you make a really bad decision. That'll make you resign without dealing with the problem. Bad emotion is anger, which is where you seek revenge and you seek to hurt somebody because you're hurting. Bad problems. So beware of decisions that are made in the worst moments. Sober-mindedness is necessary. So don't make the major decisions when you're in the valley. Wait till you feel better. And when you feel better, you'll think better. And this is why a lot of times when something is brought to me that I know this kind of upsets me, I say, here's how I say it. I'm not going to answer that the first time I hear it. What I'm actually saying a lot of times is I need to process how I feel about that and not act out of how I feel about that. I need to think it through, pray it through, get some counsel, do some things that'll help. So also, never surrender your goals when you're in distress. As in, as in giving up. Don't give them up. Time is on your side. Live to fight another day. Get through the moment. And you need creativity to solve problems, and you need ingenuity to solve problems, and in depression mode, that stuff goes away. So you need new ideas. So the deal is, I love it. They went ahead and dealt with it, but nothing got solved there. And by the way, David didn't get killed. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. All right. If I get stuck here and don't get much further. So that's step one. He strengthened himself. This is a man who had resources in himself to deal with himself. Let's talk about, a lot of you are in a bad time. Let me tell you something that is like sacred. It's sacred if you're in the worst time of your life to learn how to walk in praise and thanksgiving. And so you go to the funeral. I remember, again, I'll go back to my Baptist days, and you go to the funeral, and you're at funerals, and every time you're at a Baptist funeral, they're going to sing, "Because He Lives." And you watch people at the worst moment of their life, singing at the top of their lungs, praises, lifting up a sacrifice of praise to God. Listen, so that's one of the ways you strengthen yourself in the Lord. And let me tell you something. Do you know that this life, this veil of tears, this is the only chance you're going to get to offer that sacrifice to Him? What do you mean, Pastor? Well, listen, when we come through this veil of tears, and when we're face to face, we don't have the opportunity to offer the sacrifice of praise. because the pain and the sorrow and the trouble is over. This is why this is kingdom leadership, guys. We're kingdom people. And we're living unto our God, and we offer up the praise to God. We offer up the worship to God, and we're getting wise counsel. One of the ways you strengthen yourself in the Lord is seeking the Lord. I'm forcing this text a little bit in that category, but let's just read it. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God, and David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord. I often get mad at people who will say, well, have you sought the Lord about this? But I only get mad when I haven't. Which does happen once in a while. You're like, I thought it through. No. Inquire of the Lord. So he inquires of the Lord. Gather wise counsel. Wise counsel can only come from two places. Wise people and a wise God. And this is how you strengthen yourself, at least one way. There are many ways to strengthen yourself in the Lord, but if you want to follow the life of David, just read the Psalms. And the Psalms is David publicly strengthening himself in the Lord. David basically writes a song about every misery of his life and leads the whole nation to sing it. And you can see David processing his pain and leading to his praise, which involves, by the way, recounting the covenant history of God in his life and recounting the times that God has brought him through his crisis. There's a myriad of ways to strengthen yourself in the Lord. This is, by the way, one of the reasons why I like the gift of tongues, because it's the one gift that its sole purpose is to edify yourself. And so in the Bible, the truth about tongues is that edifying yourself is not a reason not to have tongues. It's just a reason not to make that the center of your public worship. Because you don't make yourself the center of the public worship. But it's absolutely essential and necessary. I don't know, have I talked about speaking in tongues lately? Seems like I did in a sermon. Did I do it? No, I did it when I went out of town. I find that there's few things that help me more when I'm in a mental state of brokenness than praying in tongues. Just pray in tongues. I tell people everywhere I go that it's like defragging the computer. Remember those old defrag screens? I used to watch those defrag screens because I would look at that and I would go, so that's what happens in my brain when I pray in tongues. Is that what happens is you see the confusion and on the other side is order. And I've literally found that that's one of the things that's really, really, really powerful. But don't miss this. David's a mess and he strengthens himself in the Lord. And he inquires of the Lord, and he gets the word of the Lord, and he's told to pursue. How many of you know that still doesn't get him through it all? That gets him to it all, but it doesn't get him through it all. You still got to go do it. So how do you de-escalate? In the midst of wise counsel, you can calm yourself and others. In the midst of wise counsel, you can gain perspective from God and man. In the midst of wise counsel, you can assess what you're hearing. In the midst of wise counsel, you can respond and not react. And in the midst of wise counsel, you can confirm what you need to do. And I find elements of all those things in that little passage there. Wise counsel from the Lord and from others. Some of you guys know Brian McKenna. He's going to another church now, but Brian is always a guy that I would see Brian go through something. And one of the things that I appreciated about him so much was how often he would be in a twist about something and he would go inquire of the Lord. And he would just get sorted out by the Lord. When next time I saw him, he would tell me how the Lord had sorted him out. And in other words, I would expect, he's going to come tell me how he's going to leverage the Lord's name to get me to do what he wants me to do. Never happened even one time. He would go often and seek the Lord, and he would come back and tell me how the Lord had reshaped it for him, reconfigured it for him, given him a new understanding, and given him marching orders on what he ought to do. This is called strengthening yourself in the Lord. Number 6, take action and be decisive. So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, and where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued. This is such a critical passage. He and 400 men, 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook. This is really powerful. Over and over in the Bible, few is more than many. Over and over in the Bible, the number is not the solution. In fact, David will come to a time when he's a king that he makes the mistake of boasting in his numbers and finds out it was the wrong way for him to think. Now, I just noted this one thing in this, and this is where the connection thing is. If you're going to deal with a crisis, you got to assume as much personal risk as you can. If you want to lead people. If you want to lead people, you got to lead them to do what you want them to do, and you got to be willing to do what you're asking them to do. This is an absolutely essential piece of this. And so it's got to be, we're going to do this. It's got to be, I don't know what anybody else is going to do, but this is what I'm going to do. By the way, when I was doing the study for this, I dug back into Abraham Lincoln a bit. Lincoln is fascinating. Most of you probably know this. You guys know that Lincoln's whole life was failure before he got elected president? I mean, it was a miserable failure. Then one of the things most people probably don't know about Lincoln is because we know so much, his wife gets such a bad rap because she broke down in the years of the presidency. The loss of 2 sons, and her mental health broke down, and she broke down. And so most of what people know about her is very unflattering. But if you actually study the history of Lincoln, you're going to find out he would have been nothing without her. She got him to the place where he was no longer a failure. She carried him. And then he carried her when they were in the years of pain. But I want to say that because when we started this passage, where David was when this passage started is about where Lincoln was when he got elected president. And he is absolutely a man who was formed in the crisis. And by the way, I'm not saying by the crisis. He was formed in it. And I don't know, I'm like enticed to go back and do some more studies on him. All right, take decisive action, and I can't stress this enough. Do the right thing. Do the right thing. Crisis fills us with instincts to do a lot of things that aren't right. And I just brought this one example. Some of you aren't old enough. How many of you remember the Tylenol crisis? I don't know if you knew this. I remembered when all that happened. And I remembered following that in the news. And I remembered basically saying, my thought was this: okay, that's going to go away. Deal with it, people. And when I heard Tylenol was pulling everything off the shelf, I thought that's the dumbest thing I ever heard of in my wisdom. But no, they made the big bite. They bit off the whole thing. And just so you know, if you're not old enough to remember this, the reason that every package you open has all those protections on it was the Tylenol crisis. And they led the vanguard in that. And the outcome, was that the 93% admired the company and said they'd buy from them again after they took the action to do the right thing at great cost to themselves. So listen, whenever you're in a crisis and you got to make a decision, you have got to come to this question of, is this the right thing to do? When we came to our crisis, we were faced with options. I would love to tell you that I led us through that. I did not. I survived. But it was a team of people. It was a collection of people, but one of the main people is sitting in this room, and I'm going to go ahead and tell what he did. We were commiserating, okay, what do we do about this crisis? And almost everything that we would do, listen, I want you to hear this is so important. Almost everything we had in front of us would have escalated the problem. And the deal was we had a gospel answer right in front of us. We had a gospel answer right in front of us, which is kingdom leadership. And this is why in the kingdom, the solution to our problems is not to get revenge, but to give forgiveness. And I'll never forget it when Steve Carlson spoke that over us. I've caricatured what he said into a small sentence. This was not his exact words, but this was the basic essence of it. It was kind of like, y'all want to solve this in 3 days or 3 years? And I can do the math. And we were like, well, explain that. Well, you can solve it this way and it'll be over immediately and we'll start picking up the pieces. Or you can seek justice, and 3 years from now, we'll be pointing fingers at each other, blaming each other, mad at each other, divided, and we still won't get justice. And I was like, man, that's right. And so the church acted redemptively. And because we acted redemptively, I want you to hear this. Our problem, within 90 days, all our bills were paid and there was money in the bank. I'm not even, give that a hand. I'm not even kidding. I'm talking about tens of thousands of dollars were paid back. People who had promises made to them that weren't owed money, all the promises were kept. And there was money in the bank for the next rainy day. And I'm telling you, people from outside the church started saying, we heard about what y'all did and we want to give you some money. I'll never let anybody tell me, get away with villainizing Bethel Church. Bill Johnson had his people write us a check for $25,000 and send it to us. Because he heard our story and he said, I want to partner with the spirit of forgiveness. I want to meet generosity with generosity. So listen to me, do the right thing. You want to deal with crisis leadership, you got to ask, what is the right thing to do? What are we being called on to do? And I have a path I won't go down tonight, but another night I will, because we're about out of time. So do the right thing. Constantly reevaluate. This means if you're in any kind of crisis situation, then you go, did we do the right thing? Or as the variables changes, or as the. By the way, in this case, once we decided what we were going to do in terms of redemption, we said we don't care what other facts come out. We're standing on the same place of redemption, no matter how much worse it gets. But you do reevaluate when new circumstances arise. They found an Egyptian in the open country, brought him to David, and they gave him bread and he ate. and they gave him water to drink, and they gave him a piece of cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? And he said, I'm a young man of Egypt, a servant to a Amalekite, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. All right. And we made a raid against the Negev, and against that which belongs to Judah, and against the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, will you take me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hand of my master, and I will take you down to this band. So I say allies are better than enemies. He turned an enemy into an ally. And that is what you want to do. Now, we're about to come to the solution of this, which is a violent solution. And you understand that we're in a new covenant with better promises. So we're not going to do that. But we are going to learn the lessons. That's number 8. And this is the last point. Learn the lessons. Okay, you got to learn lessons. So, you go through a crisis, what did you learn? This is really important for me, because I tell people all the time, what you do when somebody messes up will define what you become. And most of the time, we allow our best moments to turn us into something we didn't start out to be. So you got to learn some lessons, and I'm going to unpack this, and you'll see this in short order. And so what did we learn? One of the things to ask is, if you're in a crisis, is are you in the same crisis? Because if you're in the same crisis, you didn't learn anything. This is why, I hate to tell you this, but this is why people who have serial relationships often are just in the same relationship, because they didn't learn anything. Please forgive me, but that's one of the realities. People who are in bad business relationships are often in the same problem. Human beings repeat our problems because we don't learn our lessons. And that's why we got to stop and say, what happened? And how am I going to grow from this? How am I going to turn this crisis into an opportunity that can change my life? And used to be, I would hear about pastors who would go to this church and then they get run out of town, go to this church, get run out of town, go to this church, get run out of town. And sooner or later you got to go, maybe it's not the church. Maybe you didn't learn something. So also, did we expect this outcome? Because lots of times there are lessons that on the end of a crisis that you go, man, we didn't expect this. And that's where you really need to learn. And so I simply say, experience is costly, but wisdom is priceless. And the wisdom is what happens if you don't take your experience and turn it into understanding, turn it into wisdom, then you're just going to keep paying the same price. But let's unpack this, because what happens next is pretty impressive. So let's learn a lesson about how to receive the favor of the Lord. So when he had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening the next day. Not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. And David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, son or daughter, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. And David also captured the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him and said, this is David's spoil. So let's learn the lesson of how to receive the favor of the Lord. He has the favor of God on him to win this battle and to not only take what was his, but then to receive extra. Watch this. Learn the lesson of facing oppositional voices in the midst of victory. Okay, you're at your strongest point. And by the way, one of the lessons of leadership is not to let the most negative voice in the room prevail. one of the lessons of leadership is not to let the worst critics have the most influence. So one of the lessons of leadership is to learn how to face oppositional voices in the midst of victory. David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow and who had been left at the brook. And they went out to meet David, to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near, the people greeted him. And all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart. So in other words, by the way, this is the voice of fairness. Fairness is not a kingdom value. Remember Jesus with the workers who came at the end of the day, and he said they get paid as much as the people who showed up early in the morning. And everybody said, that's not fair. And Jesus basically says, I can do whatever I want with what's mine. Fairness is not a kingdom of value. So, learn the lesson that rule making is for blessing all, not punishing some. Okay, and here's where I actually amplify the rule. Don't make a rule every time somebody makes a mistake. The most miserable churches are the ones that have the most rules in their manual. I used to lead one of those churches. Here's what would happen. Every time we had a problem, we would make a standard operating procedure and a policy. And what ultimately was our goal was to never have a problem because we had policies that preempted all problems. And so people would come to you with something that was bothering them and you would just blow them off with a policy. And what would happen is you can create a culture where people will acquiesce to that, but you don't have any joy in that culture. You have a lot of bitter souls in that culture. And so here's the deal. Somebody makes a mistake. You don't make a rule to punish them. Somebody makes a mistake. You deal with the relationship. I love this because I don't know if I have time to tell a story. Let me read this passage, and if I have time, I'll tell a story. But David said, you shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He's preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall all share alike. And he made a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. And basically he said we're sharing the spoils with all. But by the way, notice something that's tucked away in this little rule he made. The solution to the original problem. There was nobody at home to guard the bags. Nobody at home to guard the family. This was actually something that he should have done in the beginning. But notice, he says, no, we're including all. So, have you ever made dumb rules? I've made some dumb rules. But learn the lesson that you and I are supposed to go from victory to victory, not from defeat to defeat. And that's why we don't make decisions. This is why you don't make decisions when you're in the valley. Make decisions when you're at your best. Let me go on with this application. Then, when David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, here's a present for you from the spoil of the enemy of the Lord. And then tells for all who it was from. And in the end it says in Hebron, for all the places where David and his men had roamed. So he shared the bounty of the victory. All right, so just a little funny story, and I'll close with this. I've always said this about not making rules. And so one time when I had teenagers, I had a bunch of cars in my garage, and I had a little 2-car garage and a little short driveway, and and somebody inevitably backed a car into a car in the driveway. It was me. So I go into the house and announce that it was a rule that no one could park behind me ever again. Of course, I'm the one that we had just had one of those cars fixed, and now I wrecked 2 cars. And somebody spoke up and said, you know, a better rule is to look behind you when you back out. So I learned the lesson of that rule. All right, is this stuff helpful? Yes. Let me bless you. Would you stand together? Let me bless you. What I like about this one, to be honest with you, is that this is actually an experience that we had. And listen, one of the reasons why we don't tell all the details of that stuff is because, let me tell you about really bad things. The details of bad things are defiling to people. The details of bad things harm people. And no one who is not involved needs to know the details after a thing's been dealt with. Get that inside of you. That will help you a lot. And so lots of times, I've actually recently been called in to deal with a crisis in a church somewhere else. And I said to them, I don't need the details. You can tell me what the big thing is. Y'all all know the details. Y'all deal with them. I don't need to know the details. So you want to keep your heart innocent. But I'm telling you, what I thought was the end of us is now a memory inside our church of the goodness of God and of the goodness of his redemption and of how the Lord takes the messes that we make and turns them into his glory. So Father, that's what we pray, that people will be kingdom leaders and that we'll go from bitterness to forgiveness and from hatred and revenge to love and peace and from failure to restoration and success. And God, that we'll go from glory to glory and from glory to glory. That you'll take us by the hand and lead us the miles we have yet to go. And Father, that you will fill us with wisdom. We pray these things in Jesus' name.